Okay, the recording's in progress. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm Susan Warwick, and hi, everyone. And I'm really happy to see so many people here tonight. So I have the pleasure of introducing Paul Jones, who in some ways doesn't really need any, introduction, because we all know him quite well, remembering his past presentations that he did for us on the winter birds of Prince Edward County and the shorebirds of Charwell Point. So he's best known here in the county as an outstanding birder and photographer. And for the past 2 years, Paul has designed and produced the beautiful calendar of his bird photos as fundraisers for both PECFN and SSJI. He's been very generous to PECFN, and we are all truly, truly thankful for his support. So basically, Paul is from Ottawa. He apparently began birding at a very young age, and it sounds as though he's been birding pretty much most of his life. And now that he's retired, he devotes much of his time to birding and photographing birds and wildlife. And his images have been used for educational and promotional purposes by PECFN, SSJI, and also PetBoat. And he and his wife, Jody, have traveled extensively, not only across Canada, but also various birding locations around the world, including Patagonia, Malaysia, Africa, and many, many others. We're very envious, actually. And these pictures, believe it or not, they can be seen on his Flickr account. So if anyone has nothing to do on a rainy afternoon, I strongly encourage you to check out his Flickr account. The photographs are absolutely incredible. And so basically, Paul retired a couple of years ago, and lucky for us, he moved here to Long Point. And he immediately joined the PetBoat, and he as a volunteer. So one of the things the first time I think I ever saw him was very, very early one morning at PetBoat, where he was doing the census of the daily bird count or census. And he sort of appeared out of the mist kind of thing. So he's kind of a very supportive of PetBoat. They are very grateful to have him. Anyway, to make a long story short, he's been incredible and very supportive of us, and we are so looking forward to his presentation tonight. So he will be sharing with us some insights on how to photograph birds, including how to apparently photograph camera-friendly birds, which I didn't even know that there were camera-friendly birds. But anyway, I'm anxious to find out about this. So please join me in welcoming Paul, and I'll pass it over to you, Paul.
Thank you for that introduction. Now I have to go through the embarrassment of trying to share the screen. Looks like I'm doing it in record time. Okay, there we go. Can everyone hear me? I see some nodding. Yes. Then let's keep going. So this is a presentation on basic bird photography, an emphasis on basic. It's for the Prince Edward County Field Naturalists, done by me, Paul Jones, and it's happening right now. Gonna talk, I don't know, for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes or so, by way of an outline. I'm gonna talk about photography expertise. I'm always get a bit embarrassed when people praise my photographs so much, and I realize how little I actually know about photography. Talk about some ethical considerations with bird photography. Briefly discuss gear. Some people really love it. It's important to have a camera and a lens, but beyond that, I'm not sure how much I can say. Camera settings, the technical stuff, not my area of expertise, but I'll go through the basics that I know and use. 5 and 6 are the pith and substance of the talk, so some suggestions about photographing birds, and then some suggestions about processing those photographs. Finally, talk about sharing photos, and then have a Q&A. So, expertise. How much do you need to know about bird photography to be a good bird photographer? Personally, I have no formal training in photography. Superficial knowledge of how cameras work, and limited computer skills. And on top of that, my eyesight is pretty poor. So you could ask, why am I doing this presentation? And I guess the answer is because even with these deficits, I can still take nice, and I'll say nice, not great bird photos. I don't have any particular extraordinary ability or special hidden secrets to offer, just some basic knowledge that I didn't invent and that I learned from others over the years and have tried to incorporate into my own practice as a photographer. In terms of others, all sorts of people from a long time ago, but also a whole bunch of folks who do photography in the county as well. Tried to assemble a quick list. I'm sure I've left people off, but these are some folks whose work I admire and have learned from. The core point, I guess, with this introduction part is that if I can take nice photos, I think anybody can. There's no special magic. There's just learn some basic skills and work at it. Ethical considerations, part 2 here. If you're going to photograph birds, you're going to disturb birds. It's just how it is. I mean, maybe if they're at a great distance, they're not going to notice you, but typically you're going to approach and they may fly away. So there's that to keep in mind. And I think you want to try to minimize that kind of disturbance. In particular, for me at least, I have a pretty firm rule about avoiding nests and nestlings. That's when birds are particularly vulnerable to predation. So I try to stay back. There are exceptions to that. I know the cliff swallows at Petbo. People are walking in and out of the door there, a couple of feet from the nest. So sometimes you can take photographs of that nest. But generally, the rule for me is to avoid nests and nestlings. Preserve habitat. I try not to trample things. Some of the most egregious behavior photographers do, sometimes they'll break or cut branches to get a better view of something. I try to avoid that. And I guess the first thing is give back. You talk about taking bird photographs, so what do you do in return? For me, I try to encourage the use of my photos for education and conservation purposes. So those are the ethical concerns. Camera gear. There's different brands, and I used to kind of follow the debates closely about which one was better. My conclusion over the years is that they're all good. I think the cameras have always been better than I am as a bird photographer, if that makes sense. They can do more than I understand. So whether it's Sony, Nikon, Pentax, Canon, you're in good shape. Camera types, there's also some fierce debate whether you use a single lens reflex or DSLR. There's some nice super zoom cameras that have a fixed lens, but can really zoom in on things. And then more recently, the mirrorless cameras that come along. Again, all are good. Find what works for you and go for it. In terms of lenses, I'm a bit more particular. I'll stress this a bit more. You need a pretty good lens for bird photography. 300 millimeters is kind of the minimum, I would say. 400 is good. It's 500 and up are best. They can get a bit pricey, but there's some good bargains on those as well. In terms of support, it's nice to have a high earning spouse who can help you purchase lenses, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about tripods, monopods, or handheld. I started birding or photography with a tripod. I found it a bit bulky, so I switched to a monopod, and now I'm mostly shooting handheld, even though I have quite a large lens. Here I am on Baffin Island, striking a dramatic pose with my gear. I use Canon. I'm kind of loyal to it for some reason, although maybe, I mean, it works for me, although maybe it's fallen a bit behind Nikon and Sony in terms of the latest tech. The camera body I use is an EOS 90D, which isn't a pro level camera, and it's actually getting kind of long in the tooth now, but it works for me. I like it. The lens I have is the one really great piece of gear. EF 600 millimeter f4, so it's big, lets in lots of light, and I really like that. It's wonderful to have a lens like that. If you have an extra kidney to sell, you could probably get one. But people do amazing photographs with much simpler, smaller lenses, better photographs than I'm able to get with that huge beast. Camera settings. This is going to push my technical knowledge to the edge. I think, I mean, if folks are photographers, they'll know all this stuff, but I'm just gonna go through it again anyway, because it was all new to me at one point and still some that I have to remind myself about. What am I gonna talk about? Shutter speed, aperture, ISO or ISO, I think it's ISO. I don't think it actually stands for anything, so ISO. Exposure compensation, big moment in my life when I learned about that, and file format. So, shutter speed. Now this, I was trying to think of some kind of simple way to define it, and the best I could come up with is how long is light let in for? So a window opens and closes quickly or slowly, lets light in, hits the sensor, and you secure your photograph. The key with bird photography is to freeze the action with a relatively high shutter speed. So we're talking 1/1000th of a second or so. You can imagine if the shutter is open for a whole second, the bird can completely fly off. You're just going to get a messy blur. So you want to go pretty quick with that. And how are you going to get that high shutter speed? Well, by manipulating the aperture and the ISO. So with aperture, the concept is not how long is the light let in, but how much light is let in. So you have a wide aperture, more light, and the shutter speed increases. A narrow aperture lets in less light, and you get that the shutter speed slows down. Here's a nice little graphic I picked up, a Creative Commons item from Wikipedia. Shows some lenses with the aperture open and then closed down. So you start off at f1.4, which there's not a lot, there's no bird lens that shoots at 1.4. It would weigh several tons, I think. But you can see f1.4, wide open. And then as we march down, and this baffled me, it's like as the numbers get bigger, the aperture gets smaller. It took me a long time to wrap my head around that. But you can see how they get smaller and smaller until we reach f8, and it's really pretty tiny. So that's a good visual representation of aperture. Aperture does something else as well, and in addition to letting in or controlling the amount of light, it also controls the depth of field, which is a fancy way of saying how much of the bird is in focus. If you have a wide aperture, then you're not going to get a whole lot that's clear and precise and in focus. As you close the aperture down, you'll get more of the bird crisp. I had trouble articulating that verbally, so I'll do it with a photograph. Here's a nice perky little Carolina wren that was out at the lighthouse at Prince Edward Point. Popped up. I took a picture of it, focused on the eye, but you can see not a whole lot of the bird is in focus, just that little narrow band there. Behind, it's fuzzy, and then the tip of the bill is kind of fuzzy as well. So that's what's in focus. This was a dark day, so I was shooting it at 4.5. Still wasn't able to get a very high shutter speed, and really had the ISO cranked up. So this ISO business, the issue is you have the aperture wide open, and you still can't get a fast enough shutter speed. So you're not going to be able to let in more light. What can you do? Well, you increase the ISO. And that will increase the shutter speed. Now, how does this work? I have no idea. For me, it's just some magic black box that does something. A dedicated button on the camera, you can find it. There is a trade-off. You can't, if you increase the ISO too much, the image quality starts to decline. And you just have to live with that, because the problem is if you don't increase the ISO, then you may not be able to get a photo at all. Okay, exposure compensation. The issue here is, and this comes up quite a bit in my bird photography, is that if it's a dark bird, a dark subject on a bright background, this can overwhelm the camera. The camera will expose for the bright background, underexposing the darker subject. So what to do? For me, this is like kind of a puzzle akin to apertures, numbers going down as the aperture got wider. If the scene is too bright, you let in more light. So you trick the camera into exposing for the darker subject instead of the brighter background. And most cameras have a dedicated button or dial that does this. On the 90D, here's the back panel. This here is kind of the international signal of exposure compensation. Down in this corner is the dial that you start twirling to dial in the exposure compensation. And there's the graph that shows what's happening, 7-0 right there. And then on top of the camera as well, there's that same graph, so we know what we're doing. Here's an example. It's actually not real. I kind of created it, but to demonstrate the principle. Dark bird on a bright background. The camera has exposed the background fairly well, considering it was snow. It brought out some tone in it, but the bird itself is totally black. So what do you do? That's the exposure compensation you set to 0. You dial in some exposure compensation. And there you go. Suddenly you have a usable photograph. Exposure compensation set to +1. You can see the other thing that's happened is that the background is now blown out. But again, that's one of those trade-offs. There was no photo previously. Now you have a bright background, but the bird itself is now exposed correctly. So there it is, no exposure compensation. And there it is with exposure compensation. Last thing on the somewhat tedious subject of camera settings is the file format. The sensor in the camera will convert light to 0s and 1s. And then that data is stored in a file. The main file formats are JPEG and RAW. JPEGs are small files. They're easy to share. They have less data than RAW, but they're great for most purposes. I think if you want to shoot in JPEGs, that's fine. RAW are larger files. They're harder to share. They require conversion to another format that's viewable. But because of all the data, there's more to process in terms of color, detail, and things like that. So my settings, I shoot RAW all the time. That was kind of one of the big steps for me, is taking photography more seriously, was switching from JPEG to RAW. Exposure compensation, I have it set to 0, but always ready to move. If I'm shooting kind of a neutral bird on neutral background, I'll keep it to 0. But if something flies overhead, I start spinning that dial to be able to capture the dark bird against a bright background. ISO 1000, which is fairly high, but I usually start fairly early in the morning when it's dark, and I'm ready to move. If there's a bit more light, I start to crank it down towards 100. If it's dark, I'll put it up to 4, 5, even 10,000 to try and capture the scene. Aperture, set it at f4 wide open, but again, ready to move. If there's extra light, then I'll start shutting it down a bit so I get more depth of field. The last thing is shutter speed, and this is for me, a complex discussion. The way I have my camera set up, it's automatically determined by aperture. So it's called aperture priority. You can do different things. Some photographers shoot full manual, so they determine what the best shutter speed is for what the best aperture is. And they figure that out on their own because they're way smarter than me. I let the camera decide because I figure it's got more going for it on the technical side than I do. So it's aperture priority. You can also set it by shutter speed priority, which will then determine the aperture. Okay, I'm kind of babbling a bit about that. To review. My computer is thinking. Oh, here we go. Expertise, not necessary. I think it's great if people have it and they can do tremendous work. I've been able to get as far as I have with a modest degree of knowledge that's sufficient to take nice photos. So I don't think people should be intimidated by expertise. They can admire it, they can strive for it, but in the meantime, they can still take great photos. Ethics, not a lot to say. I guess just be kind. Think of birds. You are going to disturb them. Try to minimize that as much as possible. Gear, I think it's all good. Learn to use what you have and enjoy it. If you want to upgrade, that's great as well. Camera settings, I think it's important to grasp the basics. That's all I've done. I've explained basically the whole extent of my knowledge on that front. So next, what do we have? Part 5, photography suggestions. The emphasis is really on suggestions. These aren't rules, although there is an asterisk there, and we'll get to that later. Pretty simple suggestions. I think probably people know most of them already, particularly if you're a bird photographer with any experience at all. I hope this isn't too simplistic for you. These are very basic suggestions, but that was the title of the talk, is basic bird photography. They're also well known. It's not like I've discovered these or have some special hidden secrets to reveal. And it's not rocket science. Again, I think these are things that anyone can implement, and many folks probably already do. Number one, find a subject. The paradox with birds, and I think we had this in the pre-discussion, is that they're everywhere, all over the place, but most are not photographable. And you can get a photo of them if you want a speck flying off in the distance through some trees. But in terms of anything that people might admire, no, it's tricky to find birds that are going to cooperate. What do? They fly off, like this cerulean warbler that abandoned me out at one point. Or they hide behind some ugly branches, like this palm warbler at Charlotte Point. Sometimes, however, they will cooperate, and that's always a great moment as a bird photographer when a bird decides to actually sit still for once. So how do you increase your chances? Again, not rocket science. You go to where birds are numerous. So in the county or anywhere, bird feeders are a great place. I do a lot of my winter photography of bird feeders. One of the little tricks I do is I tape a nice stick onto the bird feeder so the bird lands on that, and it looks like I photographed it up in Algonquin Park or something, not next to my ugly green bird feeder. Marinas in the winter in particular, the Picton Marina has been great for gulls and waterfowl, and the Wellington Harbor is always a fantastic place to go. Lots of swans and geese to photograph. The other thing to concentrate on is migration landfalls, and we're really blessed in the county with the South Shore from Point Peter over to Prince Edward Point. In the fall and spring, a lot of birds will come down there, and there's numerous opportunities to acquire photographs. So basically, the more birds there are, the more chances there are for a good photo. But as I say, like a lot of birds, they're just going to fly off, and you're not going to be able to secure a photo. Tip number 2, get close. Why would you want to do that? It's easier to focus on the bird. It's easier to secure detail. And it's easier to connect with it and sort of create some bond between the viewer and the bird. This isn't to say you always have to get close, or that people don't take great photographs of smaller birds in the frame. And maybe it's a bit of my, I don't know if it's laziness or downfall, but I tend to try to get a full frame photo of things, and they're not always the most interesting, but that's what I like to do. How are you going to get close? There's a passive approach and an active approach, and I want to thank PowerPoint for producing these amazing little slides for me, particularly the active approach logo there. The passive approach, so you identify a potential subject and you get close either by waiting patiently or sneaking up slowly. And sometimes this can take half an hour, or even longer. But you get close. And I find with shorebirds in particular, this is a good way to go. In my experience, if you try to approach shorebirds, they will often fly off, which isn't good because they need to feed and rest. Of less importance is you're not going to secure a photograph of them. So they'll either take off for New York across the lake, or they'll just fly 100 meters down the beach. But either way, you're not getting a photo. So I will plop myself down quietly in the gravel or maybe the mud, if that's the best there is, and just wait. And the birds, the shorebird sandpipers, will often just walk right up to you, almost climbing over your boots. And actually, the problem can sometimes be that they're too close and the lens won't focus on them. A more active approach is what I typically tend to do. Identify the subject and then quickly and quietly and at an angle in subdued clothing, I approach the bird. A couple points on that. The at an angle thing, I was was taught or suggested that if you kind of zigzag towards the bird rather than walk directly at it, it's less likely to be alarmed. Subdued clothing, I don't wear camouflage. I don't look like a survivalist in the woods, but I try to wear, quieter earth tones, not some kind of dazzling white or chartreuse that might startle the birds. And then I get close. Here's an example. This was actually recently in the PECFN marina. I stopped and was about to eat my McDonald's double cheeseburger combo when I looked out the window and noticed some ring-billed gulls were sitting up on the ice. And this one here seemed to have a shade darker mantle or back color. So I thought that's interesting. You can see there in comparison to a ring-billed gull. So I decided I better get close. So fortunately, there's a nice walkway, and I was able to move in fairly rapidly at an angle. And what I was concerned about was the birds were flying around. They were feeding on a gizzard shad right at Bridge Street. And I was worried the bird was going to leave. So I got in quickly, was able to get the photograph. Notice it had a dark eye. So I figured ring-billed gulls have light eyes. So this is something special. The bird did fly off or fly around and wasn't there much longer than 10 minutes or so. So it was good that I closed in and was able to get some nice photos of it. In consultation with various experts, the bird was identified as a common gull, which is interesting because actually it's super rare. It's common in England, I guess, but this was the first record for Prince Edward County, and one of only a handful of records for Ontario as a whole. So that was an example where I didn't wait. I just charged right in and moved in quickly and got the photograph. Tip number 3, work with the light. Golden mornings and evenings make for lovely photographs. Everything glows. Detail is sharp. The shadows aren't harsh yet. As the day progresses and the sun goes up, the light gets brighter and brighter and not as good for photography. For me, this is the classic golden hour photo. Nice rusty blackbird out on Long Point. You can see how everything really is glowing. The issue is the golden light, even on good days, it's basically an hour after sunrise and an hour before sunset. So you have a limited time frame there to get it. And oftentimes the sun doesn't even come out. So all you get are cloudy days. And you have to work with those. I guess it's gray light, or sometimes they call it blue light in the evening and early morning. Here's an example of a gray light photo. This was a barred owl out on Royal Road. Can see it's a softer light, subdued mood, no shadows, still very nice. Almost a black and white look to it. But even if the sun's not shining, there's still things that you can do and succeed at. You can see that's the same bird behind me there. It was dark, so wide aperture, open that lens up, and then crank the ISO up high. Tip number 4, be level. And this is one of those subjective things. I don't know if it's true or not. It's something I believe, and I think other people do as well. At least birds tend to look nicer if you photograph them on the level. So you're not shooting up at them and you're not shooting down at them. Now I didn't have some good examples, so I got my little decoy and put him on the beach. And this is an angle down. It's not quite as dramatic as if it was a real bird, but I'm standing up and the camera's pointing down at maybe 20, 30 degrees. And the picture's all right, but you can see there isn't much distinguishing the background around the bird. So what I did was I lay down on a nice gravel. And here's the shot on the level with the bird. And you can see how the background blurs and the foreground separates and is more distinct. So even though that's not the greatest example probably in the world, I still urge people to try to shoot things on the level, particularly with waterfowl and that water surface makes for interesting photo. What else? Background rules, in the sense that background rules, not rules about background. Birds look nicer with an interesting backdrop. So watch the background. I noticed that when I started, I was just happy to get the bird in the frame. Didn't matter if it was in focus. The next big breakthrough was actually being able to focus on the bird. And once I had mastered that after a while, I started to notice how important the background was. So when I'm photographing something now, I kind of look at the bird and let it take care of itself as long as I'm focused on the eye. And I'm really watching the background, looking for interesting elements or distracting elements. And I'll move around, you know, the bird's gonna be there and I'll move back and forth this way and that to try to get an angle at the bird that secures the best background. An example of this is garbage or trash. Oftentimes there'll be some glaring, you know, bright fluorescent Tim Hortons mug or something, or some cup that someone threw in the background. So you want to wait till the bird moves away from that. And then once you've secured the photo, of course, pick up the mug and dispose of it properly. Here's an example of a nice bird. And this was kind of the style at one point. It was that you get a bird on a thin branch with a totally plain background. And it's nice enough. It's good as a sort of educational tool of what the bird looks like. In this case, a blue-gray gnatcatcher, Charwell Point. But it's kind of on the boring side. So what I look for is a complex background. You can see in this, there's just more happening, and I think it's more interesting. You can see how these buds mirror the color of the bird's face, and all the twigs are surrounded by are covered with midges. So kind of an interesting environmental point there about the importance of birds being able to find places to rest and refuel on their migration. Sometimes the background is more interesting than the bird. This is a great long-tailed duck from Sandbanks. And again, it's really the setting that makes the photograph, not the bird itself. Tip number 6, tell a story. You can include some behavior, an item of visual interest, some habitat. Here's an example. This is an Iceland gull down at the marina. What's the story? The bird is sitting, which is not a particularly compelling story. I guess people will look at this and it's good for identification purposes, but it's not that gripping a shot. However, here the story gets a bit more complicated. The bird is flying, which is sort of neat, and has a friend. So the viewer engages more with this and is interested in, perhaps wonders where they've come from and where they're going. In terms of including an item of visual interest, in this case, the bird has a reflection. Maybe he's wondering about its own existence and the meaning of life, or whatever, but it's just, it adds a certain element to the photograph. In this case, the bird has a reflection. It also has a friend, and the friend has a reflection. So in terms of the story, you're practically writing a novel here compared to the Iceland gull just sitting by itself on the ice. Tip number 7, composition. Something called the rule of thirds, and this is where I put that asterisk there. It's called the rule of thirds. Again, for me, this is just a suggestion. People kind of like it. It works for me. And it's also all I've got in terms of composition tips. It's how I frame almost all my photographs. How does it work? Well, here's a nice barred sandpiper down at Charwell Point. And typically I'll line birds up right in the middle of the camera. That's where I keep the focus point. So there it is there. But if you kind of form a grid pattern in the frame, you can divide it up into thirds. And you can see what happens if you put the bird over on that third. It really doesn't, there's the middle and the other third. It really doesn't have anywhere to go. And it's kind of crowded in, so it's just less effective visually. On the other hand, you line the bird up on that far third, not the center or that sector there. And the bird has room to move. Like if it's a flying bird, it's got space. If it's standing there, it can walk into something. So I think, I don't know what exactly happens, but it creates a nicer connection with the bird and a more pleasing frame aesthetically. So there's the bird in the center, and then there's the bird over to the side. I like the one over to the side, using the rule of thirds. I think people kind of diss it as being a bit simplistic or cliche, but like I say, it works for me. Tip number 8, the eye. I don't have any catchphrase for this except the eye. For me, it's the primary focus point. When I see a bird, that's what I start to try to focus on. I'm not sure, I guess there are other things you could focus on. I'm not sure what they might be, but to really make that connection with the bird, you want to make sure the eye is there for you. I think bird photographers talk about making eye contact. and it connects the viewer to the bird. A couple tricky things. One thing is birds are blinking all the time. So you have to make sure the eye is open. And also make sure that it's clear. This isn't totally obvious in the uncropped version, but you have to make sure it's clear. As you probably know, birds have a nictitating membrane, which they will slide over their eye, and it kind of can blank out the eye a little bit. So again, you got to check for that. Tip number 9, catch light. This is a sparkle of reflected light in the eye that adds life and connection to the photo. Here's an unusually cooperative peregrine falcon that was at Point Peter, and you can see that little glimmer in the eye, which may not look like much, but if you remove it, it's like you're staring into the dead soul of Satan or something. So let's put that back, and there we go. And it looks just a lot more compelling. Sometimes if you're shooting into the sun, sometimes it's harder to get the catch light, so you need to move around a bit and secure that. But it's pretty important. As you can see, oh, horrible. And then there it is, nice. Head tilt, getting a little esoteric here, but you have some options. You can photograph the bird from the side on, the angle towards you or completely towards you, a little bit of and also angled away. For me, side on is good. I like angled towards a little bit more. Angle away doesn't really work for me. Here's an example. This is a nice wood duck down the Picton Marina. A nice side-on shot. It's a compelling photo. It's fine, but look what happens when it tilts its head a little towards me. Again, side and then towards. Really adds life to the photo. Gives it some personality, more connection. So watch the head tilt. Another little tip. The last tip is quantity. You need, I need to take lots of pictures of each bird and hope that at least one is good. And then when I'm done, I delete all but the best. You can see those things like catch light, head tilt, nictitating membrane, eye blinking, all sorts of stuff, the background. In contrast to a studio photographer or even a landscape photographer, you have sometimes just seconds to capture a subject you have no control over. Birds bouncing around. So I just kind of, what was the expression? Spray and pray, just shoot photo after photo and hope that one is good. Here's a frame from my catalog. This is that marsh wren from earlier. I probably took in about a 5-minute span, probably 200 or 300 photos, most of which I deleted. I saved probably 20 or 30 of them, and these are them there. So really important to take a lot of photos. Okay, to review the photography tips. Find a subject, look for where there's lots of birds and hope for the best. Get close, either passively or actively. Be aware of the light, look for that golden light and do the best you can when the light's not there. Background is super important. I can't stress that enough. I don't think my little fake duck thing was the best demonstration of the principle, but being on the level is important as well. Composed by thirds, kind of a cliche, but it does work. Tell a story. It's something I don't always do. Often I just wait for the bird to stop and take a picture of it, but if there's something happening, it makes it a more compelling thing to view. Make eye contact, that's important. Get that catch light. Watch the head tilt and take lots of pictures in order to optimize your chances at these different things. Okay, where are we? Part 6, processing suggestions. You filled your card with images. Are you done? No, you're only halfway to the finish line. This was a big shock for me. Back in the days of film, I would take some photos and send them off, and then months later get them back. And all the work was done in the lab somewhere. With digital photography, you have an incredible opportunity to manipulate the images yourself. So step 1, select the badly flawed images and delete. I delete most of them in camera. Some people say you shouldn't do that. You should put them all up in the big screen, but that would just fill up my hard drive too much. So I delete a lot of them in the camera, like clearly flawed ones where the bird's cut in half or is blurry or something like that. Get rid of those, save the best ones. Then upload them to a device, could be your phone, laptop, hard drive, tablet, wherever your software is, get them onto that and run them through those programs to get the best results. Now, there's a bunch of these different programs. Probably the best known is Adobe Photoshop. I took a look at that. I just found it too complicated. So what I use is Adobe Lightroom. I'm not officially endorsing it. I'm not a spokesperson for Adobe Lightroom. I really like it. It was switching to RAW and then getting Adobe Lightroom were big changes for me in my photography practice. And there may be other ones. Once I found Adobe Lightroom, I was happy with that. Then people talk about workflow. So you've got your images, they're uploaded, you have your program ready. What do? The steps for me are crop, clone, denoise, lighten or darken, sharpen, work with the color, and then export out. I was directly told when I reviewed this presentation that this was the wrong order. It could well be. It's what I use. Maybe there's a better way to do it. Get a bit more into what exactly is going on. So if we start with cropping photos, why would you do this? You can magnify the bird. I'm not sure that's exactly the correct terminology, but you can bring the bird closer. You can create a better composition, and you can remove offending objects. So by way of example, here's a nice photo of a merlin. This was out on Royal Road towards the South Shore. A bit small in the frame, and some detritus of this poor mourning dove there in the corner, maybe distracting a little bit. So load it into Lightroom, put it in the develop module, select the crop tool, which you can see has happened here. Line the bird up in that rule of thirds, and you can see now that distracting element is gone, and then push it out, and there it is. So you start with this and you crop into that. Not the most exceptional photograph in the world, but I was happy to get this result. Again, it's funny, just triggered now is that there are ethical considerations. I didn't want to get too close. I didn't want the bird to lose its prey, so I stayed well back. The result was the bird was fairly far away, but through cropping, I was able to get a decent image. One little caution, I have a temptation to crop too close, but it's best not to crop too close. Image quality starts to deteriorate, to decline, and the edges crowd the bird. I think, as I say, I think I photograph things a bit too big in the frame, but there's a certain point where you don't want to get too close in. Next, cloning. This is to eliminate distractions, so this is what I use it for. So you can replace offending elements within the picture from inoffensive elements from elsewhere in the image. I'll try to visualize that concept. So here's an Iceland gull. This was out at Prince Edward Point. And there were things in the picture I just found distracting. I guess I like an orderly universe. So there's that kind of dark blob there. And then ground up quagga mussels, big chunks of them and some smaller chunks. So I put it into Lightroom, selected the cloning tool, and then started, probably took me 15, 20 minutes to remove the elements. So I grabbed a part of kind of white background and put it where the dark one is, clone that in. Here was the original. And then here's after I had cleaned it up through cloning. I don't know, maybe people like those quagga mussels. I found it distracting. I like kind of a clean picture, so that's what I did with that. Again, what it was like, and then after the cloning process. Next, noise. This is speckling on the image. It's caused by photons or something. I don't understand the exact physics of it. Low light. I don't know, I'll give an example. Here's a nice Townsend solitaire that was out at Sandbanks on Christmas Eve. I don't know if you can see on the screen you're looking at, but its background is a little bit distorted by this fine speckling. If we zoom in a bit, maybe you can see it a bit better. You can see the image is slightly broken up by that. Put it into Lightroom, select they have a new, more sophisticated denoising tool that runs off artificial intelligence. Hit the enhance button, and you go from this to that. The noise disappears, the image looks nicer. It also looks a bit, I mean, artificial, as one might expect with artificial intelligence, a bit waxy and unrealistic. But when you compare this with this, my preference is for the denoised version. So that's another part of that workflow, is to denoise the photo. Importantly, lighten and darken. I think good photographers, great photographers, never under or overexpose an image, but unfortunately I do that all the time. Here's an example of a white-crowned sparrow of the Gamble's race that was in my backyard. I probably cranked in some exposure compensation, but not enough. So it was dark. I did something wrong. Put it into Lightroom, select the bird itself, not the whole photo. With the special tool that allows you to select portions of the image and lighten it up. You can see initially the sliders are all set to 0, but then you put more exposure in and you can end up with a really, I think, really nice, almost technical drawing image of this bird. So before, after. You can also encounter the opposite problem. Here's a merlin, also out at Prince Edward Point. It's fairly well exposed, but the background is kind of blown out as light. So again, do the same thing, except instead of selecting the bird, you select the background and darken it. And there's the final result after you do that processing. So before and after. Sharpening. Why would you do this? I don't know, it makes the bird look nicer, brings out detail. Here's an example. This is a redpoll again at my bird feeder. A bit fuzzy. I don't know what exactly you can see on your screen, but it's in pretty good focus, but there was some slight blurriness to it, maybe caused by heat distortion, or maybe I missed the focus a little bit. But then you sharpen it and you can see that it really changes. Well, I hope you can see that it changes. Some people say less is more with sharpening, that you should be easy on it. I think more is more. I tend to over sharpen everything. It's just what I like to do. I think maybe because my own eyesight's a bit blurry, it's fun to control the world and make things sharp. Color. Why would you want to interfere or change color? Make the image more attractive. Either bring out what you thought was the scene's true appearance or what you would have liked the appearance to be. I think subtlety is important here, but I'm not always subtle. Here's an example of our friendly barred owl from the poster. And this nice, this is around Halloween, so it's got this orange pumpkin-like Halloween-y vibe to it, autumnal colors. This was the original photo that the camera captured. And I thought that's nice enough, but there's some orange in the background and I can work with that. So I loaded it up, selected the background, and then moved the various sliders around to get this result. So there it is, original, and then that happened there. I don't know if people might think that that was fake or cheating somehow, and perhaps it is, but it's what I liked. I think it's a more dramatic, interesting photo, and it captures or conveys the scene as my eye saw it and maybe the camera didn't capture. Once you're done that, export it out. Create a shareable file. If you're shooting RAW, you need to convert it into another format, typically JPEG. And with a simple push of the button, it will produce the final file for you. What do you do with that? I'm going to conclude with a brief chat about sharing photos. Bunch of different options. You can keep them on a hard drive. Sometimes I lie awake worrying at night about all the amazing photos people have that have never left their hard drive. I know some folks just like to take photos and keep them on the hard drive, and that's great. Other options is you show them to friends and family, albums, Christmas cards, sometimes prints that you can frame, very nice. You can share them more broadly on kind of a semi-industrial scale with social media. And you can share to promote education and conservation, which I try to do with my images. The other thing is you can share them to try to promote sales. I have nothing to offer on that. I think I've tried to sell a few photos, but it's a whole lot of work, and it's another kind of occupation in itself to try to make money off this. It's not something I've been able to do. Mentioned social media. People know, I think, the big names: Instagram, Facebook, SmugMug, and the one that I like in particular is Flickr. It's not the most vibrant place, but it's very friendly. It's a lack of rancor. People have nice things to say and to contribute with photos. Here's my homepage, at least the album homepage for my Flickr site. You can see I have an album there for Prince Edward County as well as some other places. Flickr provides a summary of what's happening with your photos, who's looking at them. And you can see I've been up on about 10 years and have almost 12 million views, which like blows me away. It just quietly chugs away in the background, people searching through it, looking at things, and some really great exposure there. Here's an example. I was in Patagonia and I saw a pudu, which is a tiny deer that lives in the rainforest there. I took a photo of it, put it up on Flickr, where it did fairly well. But some Chilean ecologists were searching for a pudu photo. They saw mine, I provided, and it ended up in a book promoting conservation in Chile, which was nice. So that's, for me, sort of the sharing cycle: is acquire the photo, distribute it, post it up, and then perhaps people can use it for a good cause. Speaking of good causes, more locally, and kind of circling back to that issue of birding, of photography ethics, of you're taking bird photos and what can you get back. You can use your photos to assist with conservation and education efforts, like this one here, closer to home. So to conclude, expertise is not necessary. I think you need skill, patience, and craft, but you don't require extraordinary levels of knowledge to take nice photos. Ethics: be kind, give back. Gear, it's all good. Just as I don't think you need that great expertise. You also don't need the latest and greatest fanciest stuff. There's a lot of good, fairly inexpensive equipment out there that people take amazing photos with. Camera settings: grasp the basics. That's all I've done, and that works for me. It's gotten me as far as it has. Photography tips, again, I ran through them. There's a bunch more, but they're just basic sort of logical skills to have. Processing tips, again, basic skills. I haven't taken it too far. I haven't got into learning Photoshop and really manipulating images, like changing backgrounds and stuff like that. So it's kind of the basic level knowledge I have is sufficient to take to produce nice images. Sharing photos, yes. Once you've taken them, there's a lot of nice things you can do. So that's it. Questions?
Okay, Paul, it's Amy here. I've unmuted and got some stuff in the chat. Paul is still sharing screen, so please type up your questions or comments in the chat. And so I'm going to start with some comments that came in during the talk. All right, Paul?
Yeah.
This one's from Bert. But the 90D is crop sensor. No. So your 600 millimeter lens has a working focal length of 960 millimeters?
That is absolutely correct. I was using a full frame camera, so there wasn't that crop effect. And I was finding that I just wasn't getting the magnification or the reach that I wanted. So I went from a full frame camera to that crop camera.
Excellent, thank you. And this is from John Foster. ISO means International Standards Organization.
I was told that, but then I was told it didn't. And that the proper thing to say was ISO. I used to follow these debates very closely and, lie awake anxiously at night, whether it was ISO or ISO. But now I don't care. I'm interested to know that it actually does mean something. And I'll switch back to calling it ISO.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Okay, here's another comment from Bert. Paul, have you tried don't know what LR means. It might be, okay, let's just say LR remove tool, supersedes clone and much better.
No, but I will now.
There you go. And John Foster, what do you think about lossless extensions like TIFF and PNG?
I don't think about them at all. Because wrapping my head around RAW and JPEG kind of filled up most of my available brain circuitry. I know that those other ones, and I think professional photographers use those. I think when I worked with graphic designers on other stuff in the old days, they liked the TIFF files because they were big and they had lots of data in them. For my purposes, and I think with a lot of my photography, there are some sort of basic things that get me as far as I need to go. And for me, it's RAW and JPEG. I know there's other formats, and there's probably very good reasons to use them, but I don't, that they escape me.
Thanks, Paul. Now here's another question from Bert. John.
See, this is why I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert.
It's wonderful. It's great.
I hope I haven't annoyed the
Yeah.
photographers too much with the basic level that I'm presenting stuff.
Yeah, Paul, I have to tell you that I went to film school and I had a year of photography when it was still all chemical. And so I'm sitting here thinking about noise versus film speed, grain,
Yeah.
Dodging and burning,
Yeah.
pushing film and all that stuff. So it actually really spoke to me, but I don't know the digital world at all. So that was really something. So
well, I was going to mention grain because that's how I understand it. When it went digital, they started calling it noise.
Mhm.
When I was using film, it was grain. And back in those days, I think like the highest film speed was, if you were shooting 800, it was insane.
Yeah.
Now you can shoot 10,000, which I don't know is an exact equivalent, but with digital you can go so much farther. And even the noise suppression in the cameras themselves is now so much better. That solitaire example, like even the undenoised version still look pretty good.
Yeah. Yes. Well, really impressive. And I loved your that you would show comparisons with the images and that you waited a long time in your talk before you started showing photography, your actual photographs was terrific. Okay, but now I digress. Let's go back to the chat function from Birch. John, if Paul were using Photoshop, then he'd be into TIFF in no time. Oh, this is John. This is Bert responding to John Foster from his question. What do you think about lossless and extensions like TIFF and PNG? Bert answers, John, if Paul were using Photoshop, then he'd be into TIFF in no time. Not really a matter of concern in Lightroom. There you go. This is
okay. As I say, like I've gotten so far, and in some respects, I've just scratched the surface of photography and bird photography, but the results are nice photos. So I don't want to be intimidated myself by too complex technicalities. And I don't want anyone who's just picking up a camera to think that they have to learn everything right away. But I do respect people who have done that and have greater knowledge than me, and there's a lot of those folks.
Okay, and then John Foster writes a minute later, JPEGs are lossy, and I think maybe he means glossy, I'm not sure, are lossy over time. John, you can correct me.
Well, here, I'm going to show, I think, a technical detail that I learned at one point. I think every time you pump out a JPEG, it changes a little bit. So that over time the image varies. Whereas with RAW, you have that stable base to go back on.
Okay, here's a question from Dave Thomas. Paul, do you ever make your own prints?
I did. I had a printer at one point, but the inkjets kept jamming, and I think maybe it was a big scam by the printing industry to make these printers that just didn't work for very long. So I spent a lot of money on ink and whatnot. And then I would take them to photo services to get prints made. But now I mostly, I'm in almost 100% simply keep them in digital form and distribute them that way. I went down to Printcraft. You see, you got this nice canvas made. So that's kind of as far as I'm taking things.
And you also did the calendar for us.
Yeah. But I know a lot of folks create incredible prints. They have them framed. I should probably do that, but I'm going to put what I do now is occupying most of my energy and taking it and starting to become serious about printing off, doing prints would be a big step. Also, I don't have much space on my walls, so there's a limit to what I can do with them.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, here's a comment from Kate Hayday. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and great tips for processing. Affinity makes a nice alternative to the Adobe suite for those who don't have it. One-time payment, no subscription. Darktable is an open source and I think free alternative to Lightroom, though I found the interface challenging. Any comment on that?
That's super helpful. I think complaints were that Adobe went from kind of a standalone disk and now it's a subscription service where you have to keep paying to use it. It seems a little much sometimes, but I do have some sympathy for Adobe because a lot of people I knew were simply using pirated copies. And so I think maybe Adobe was forced in that direction. When I said I took no photography training, I misrepresented a little bit. I did take a brief course in Lightroom and learned how to use it and found that super helpful. And I think that was a game changer for my photography. Thank you so much for mentioning other ones as well, because if this isn't a huge part of your life, then the expense of Lightroom maybe can be a bit much. And it's good to know there's some other programs you can use, including open source ones. So thank you.
That's great. Here's another comment from Bert then. Kate, I can put you probably in touch with Darktable experts. There you go. And Kate says, thank you. I've fallen off the photography wagon, but this might inspire me to get back on. So this is between Bert and Kate. Okay. And here we get from John Foster. This is there's an AB reply. That's when Joanne Dewey called me during the middle of the recording. And then she joined the Zoom. John Foster, this is an excellent presentation. Thanks. Bert. Paul, for printing. Mike Godauer in Trenton. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. Have you heard of him?
No, but if that's the person to use, then I will probably prevail myself for their services.
Okay, John Foster, try Epson for printing. Canva can be good for prints.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it to the professionals. What was the name again of the person in Trenton?
Mike Godauer, G-A-U-D-A-U-R.
It's pronounced Gadur.
Oh, Gadur. Thank you, Ellie. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Okay, and then from John Foster again, good programs are Corel Paint Shop Pro, Corel Aftershop, and Adobe Premiere Elements, as well as Adobe Photoshop Elements.
Yeah, there's that thing about old dogs and new tricks. The trick I learned was Lightroom, and again, I think that exhausted my tech potential.
Great.
It's probably the only program I know other than like Safari or something.
Charlie Dobbin says, thanks, I learned a lot. And Bert again, like Ellie did, corrects me on my pronunciation of Gordura. Thank you. Okay, let me go back. Okay, Charlie Dobbin, and what about using an iPhone?
You know what? I did an original version of this, including all my accumulated knowledge, and it was about 3 hours long.
Yeah.
I cut out a lot of stuff. And when I was going to talk about gear, I was going to say, you want to use what you have. You can aspire to something more, but the best camera you have is the one that you're with. And I've taken some beautiful shots, not so much of birds with the iPhone, but great shots of amphibians. And I in an earlier version, I had an extraordinary picture of a tree frog on a gray lichen tree that I took with an iPhone. It was just beautiful. So, yeah, the other thing people are able to do is hold the iPhone. Look, I have one right here, to their binoculars and take pictures through their binoculars and get some, they're not maybe tip-top quality, but particularly for rare birds, if you want to confirm it, that's something you can do. So yeah, and then often also, if I want to photograph a landscape or a habitat, I'll bring out the iPhone and use that. So yeah, all in favor of iPhones. You're just not going to get the same kind of detail on a distant bird that you would with a big telephone.
Thanks, Paul. And then a final comment, it looks like from, oops, okay, we've got a few more. Marilyn Sprisler, also a great program, which can be a one-time purchase. Just moved, sorry. Can be one-time purchase or subscription. ON1 Photo Raw. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about talking about Adobe Lightroom and hate is too strong a word for it, but there is a certain, I mean, it's kind of the corporate world dominating oppressive capitalist photo processing tool. But it's the one I learned to use and I'm happy with it. But I'm also super happy that people are making other suggestions, other things to use. As I say, I got onto Lightroom and I've learned it, and it's now the one I'm doing. But I think for other people to have other options is great.
Thanks, Paul. And here's a comment from Ian Barker, one of the photographers you mentioned who you admire. Great presentation, Paul. Perfect, non-intimidating pitch and too modest.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for all the wonderful, in particular, waterfowl photos you've taken.
Okay, and another comment, I agree with you, Paul, there. Okay, and Ian has also been really generous with PECFN and all of us with his photos for education and everything else. And then John Foster has another comment. Those programs I mentioned are great if you don't have a lot of money. I think with this recording too, when it goes up on the SSJI YouTube, I think you can get access to the chat comments. So that'll be great too, if anybody's wanting all these tips that that these great photographers are giving.
I think if you're really good with the internet, you could type into Google alternatives to Lightroom.
Right.
And, a lot of things would pop up. I didn't want to seem like I guess I'm endorsing Lightroom, but it's what I use, so it's what I can talk about. I think a lot of other programs do very similar things, probably better and cheaper, but Lightroom is what I'm kind of locked into.
Well, Paul, that's it for the comments and question. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Oh, I missed a bit of John's comment after that sentence because it was down at the bottom of my screen. Canon, Nikon, Fuji, and Panasonic have largely gotten out of making autofocus cameras in favor of smartphones. Very interesting. There you go. Okay, so Paul, I think that sums it up for the chat and the questions. If you stop sharing your screen, I think Jerry will end the meeting.
Well, before I end the meeting, I'm going to thank you, Paul. And so I was blown away by that. It's so down to earth, unintimidating, as I think Ian said. Very clear, beautifully organized, some great photos. And although many things struck me, but what particularly struck me, as I've been a user of software in various ways for many years, I love the fact that when you demonstrated what you were doing with Lightroom, you actually documented the settings that you used to make those changes to your files. And that was so helpful. That it would certainly encourage me to get Lightroom. And anyway, thank you. Thanks again. It was terrific. And Amy has something for you.
We have a gift bag for you, Paul. It's actually, I'm so sorry this room's so dark. Sewn by Myrna with some goodies in it, which we will get to you somehow soon. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome, and thank you for the kind words.
Okay, thank you everyone, and it's been a great meeting, and thanks everyone for coming, guest members, everybody. Okay, good night.
Good night.
Thanks. It was wonderful. Bye.